Hello, and welcome to the second session of today's conference, which is entitled Queer Identity in Public and Private. I'm Harry Prance. I'm a second-year research student here working on Byzantine Eucharistic objects. Now, you might have guessed, but my research doesn't concern an inherently queer canon of work, or necessarily always come from an explicitly queer methodological perspective. But I have to say the conversation we're having today strikes me as a particularly vital one. I, and I suspect other queer people, will know the perils and the pleasures of an identity that exists across and between the public and the private, the professional and the personal. And for queer university workers, this boundary is perhaps a more permeable one than for most. To quote Miss Jean Brodie, "Education, from the Latin ex meaning out of and duco I lead, is a leading out." Well, for us queers, it's perhaps more of a coming out. It certainly has been for me. From the pink scare of the 1950s with its concomitant myth of the Homintern, the queer double agent, the red in your bed, to Stonewall, coming out and queer visibility, politics on both sides of the culture wars can seem often to evolve around a rather simplistic question, with the potential for both personal violence and affirming solidarity. How do you know a queer when you see one? Well, I'm delighted to introduce the two papers in this session, which each in some way, and with a lot more nuance, deal with the possibilities and anxieties around queerness in the public and the private. Our first speaker in this session is Roberto Filippello, a doctoral researcher and teaching assistant at Edinburgh College of Art, University of Edinburgh. His academic interests include aesthetics, queer theory, and affect studies. His research project investigates the staging of queer gestures and feelings in independent fashion photography at the turn of the 21st century. Prior to embarking on his PhD, he obtained an MA from the New School, New York, and a BA from Università Roma Tre. Roberto is the convener with Dr. Lucy Weir of Sexes, a research cluster involving early career... Is that... I said, please correct me. Early career researchers and senior faculty in the fields of gender and sexualities, and he organises a monthly queer theory discussion group for PhD students across the colleges of arts, humanities and social sciences. Roberto's paper today is entitled The Queer Affective Politics of the Fashion Image. Thank you, Roberto.
So the project I'm presenting today is quite unrelated from my PhD research, actually. The project I'm presenting today, in the project I'm presenting today, I try to identify what may be queer about the fashion image, regardless of its possible representation of queer subjects or its queer subcultural references. The main questions that I want to address regard the queer epistemic value of the fashion image and respond to one broader concern. How can we talk about aesthetic practices that, despite their visual content not being necessarily queer, produce indeed queer affects or sensations, which functions as vectors for generating forms of queer knowledge? In a nutshell, I'm interested in the possibility of thinking queer aesthetic experience not as based on the queer content of representation, but rather in terms of the collective mobilization of our senses. I look at fashion photography as a starting point for thinking about aesthetic experiences in these terms, and I conceive the fashion image as an interface for queer sensory experience. This paper uses two main theoretical tools, the periperformative and hapticity, and is organized into two sections: queer sensory experience and toward the queer aesthetic community. Number one, queer sensory experience. When applied to photography, the term periperformative refers to an imaginative affective scene that extends beyond and takes place at the borders of the photograph, or, using Eve Sedgwick's words, in the neighborhood of its frame. In its extension beyond the semiotic, photography suggests the possibility of an aesthetic experience that, through the viewer's imagination, may have an impact beyond itself. The scene of a photographic image can in fact suggest an excess of sense beyond the boundaries of its framework, which opens up other potential senses of the world. The fashion photograph in particular can be construed as a periperformative genre insofar as it operates within the same space as the aesthetic production of norms of beauty, gender, and demeanor, namely the space of consumerist culture. However, its rhetorical force lies, I believe, in the capacity to displace and mobilize those very norms by promoting in the viewer an affective encounter with the image that evades the mere commercial function of product advertising. Queer art historian John Porrico has suggested that photographs can operate periperformatively, for they gesture beyond the photographic frame towards, and I quote, a blind field of affective experiences, end quote. This extra of the photographic image enables a mobilization of desire beyond the visible. In the fashion image, this subtle beyond is identifiable in what Yves Sedgwick called tactile plus emotional, namely a particular intimacy that subsists between emotions and the textural quality of the photograph that triggers our haptic engagement. In the production of a fashion photographic image, the choice of camera angles, the type of focus, and the post-production technologies are devices aimed at enhancing the sensual properties of clothing as a way to evoke sensory responses, that is, to stimulate an embodied involvement in the beholder. This mimetic capacity of the image to animate clothing through various registers is at the core of the epistemic stimulation triggered by haptic visuality. Giuliana Bruno wrote that the fashion image designs through its textual materiality the folds of our emotional landscape. That is to say that we are involved in the folds of the image, and in such interaction wherein our sensorium is engaged, we can feel emotionally altered. The sartorial and chromatic qualities of the dresses that we encounter in the fashion photographic image, for instance, enfold us in an affective interaction that tunes our aesthetic experience. These qualities contribute to shaping an affective atmosphere in which we are immersed. There is indeed, according to Deleuze, a connection between the folds of clothing and the texture of our psychic interiority. The former exert a spiritual force over our body, folding and modulating its inside. By touching the surface of the fashion photographic image with our eyes, we are corporeally implicated in the very matter of the image. In view of its constitutive hapticity, the fashion image may herald a cross-modal interaction wherein we feel like we're both touching and are being touched. I wish to further Giuliana Bruno's suggestion that when we touch fabrics with our eyes, we are inevitably touched back in the form of an affective return, by arguing that the fashion image relies on this haptic source also as a way to trigger lateral desires and fantasies across what I've called the periperformative field of aesthetic engagement. The periperformative spacing of the photo allows us to imagine a proliferation of queer meanings and affects beyond the containability of signification. This marks the possibility of thinking about a sensory epistemology in relation to queer experience, rooted in the idea that the tactile experience of fashion images activates queer imaginings and meanings. I have outlined thus far two quintessential aspects of the fashion image. First, the periperformative as the gesture that, acting in the vicinity of norms, exceeds them, hence opening up a space for critiquing the terms under which the norms are constituted. The allusion of the fashion photograph to an imaginative beyond, a dreamlike imaginative escape, could thus be an opportunity for queer subjects to reconfigure the beyond of the image as a site of ambivalence and pleasure. Second, fashion photographs activate a queer sensory experience that involves the viewers with the vibrant properties of the image. In addition to prompting bodily awareness, this also induces, as Dana Seidler wrote in relation to Catherine Opie's photographs, novel forms of subjectivity. The materiality and the sensual pleasure produced by the fabrics and curtains used as a background in Opie's portraits, in fact, and I quote, develop a vocabulary of sensory experience that supplies the means to imagine the animating textures of queer subjectivity, end quote. Seidler goes on to write, in Opie's images, etchings, colors, and textiles forge a visual field of queerness, a field in which queerness is irreducible to gender crossing, identification, or object choice, and opened up to the realm of the senses. Opie produces aesthetic relationality by materializing the formal pleasure of sensual perception. So this suggests queerness as a mode of knowledge formation that operates via feeling rather than rationality. Section 2, towards a queer aesthetic community. What I'm trying to do is to displace queerness onto the register of sensation and suggest that a queer sensorial grasping of the fashion image might enable us to construe it as a site for the production and investments of queer desires and fantasies. By speaking of queerness as an affective register, I foreground the capacity of aesthetic affect to cut across axes of difference and to shape imaginative relations. This does not imply an obliteration of the specificities of gay, lesbian, trans, and other subjectivities. However, an ethically productive engagement with queer visuals is not premised axiomatically on subjective identifications. Photographs, in fact, can themselves be responsible for shaping identifications and fantasies that might have a queer shared transformative impact, albeit resonating differently based on the viewer's subjectivity. This points to a possible formulation of queer identification, not as a pre-given, presupposed, and implicated mode of engaging in the aesthetic experience of specifically gay, lesbian, or trans-identified subjects, but rather as a collective endeavor that has the potential to open an horizon of affective and aesthetic possibilities. My suggestion that fashion photographs unfold sensorial possibilities of approaching the world queerly is germane to the idea that the aesthetic moment can potentially generate collective transformations which become instances of what Lauren Berlant and Michael Werner, among others, have called queer world making. Along these lines, aesthetics can produce different articulation of one's identities as well as new worldviews or orientations to the world. According to this approach, emotional experience is what imaginatively and queerly unites us. Through an affective engagement with the aesthetic, the viewer is virtually connected to other viewers. This idea, which conjures and queers Kant's claim that the aesthetic contemplation generates a sensuous experience that is simultaneously individual and collective, reveals a construal of art as a non-autonomous sphere in which queer collective formations are made possible. I believe that such a formulation can be aligned with Jean-Luc Nancy's theorization of the photographic image as a mode of exposure to being in common. For Nancy, the image is a site of resonance, wherein our bodies imaginatively come together as a collectivity. Precisely, our senses become collectively attuned to the image in a relation of resonance. We share the image with others, and within this sharing, what he calls le partager, we are put in touch. Phrased differently, the image sets the scene for our being in common. It is a medium that engages us with the alterity of one another as a community. Additionally, for Nancy, our contact with one another occurs through the image by way of an hallucinatory exposure to strangeness. In this shared estrangement, we are in common. Photography has thus the purpose of exposing us to a sense of community which does not imply a communal fusion, but rather retains one singularity in a shared aesthetic space. Community for Nancy is a praxis of sense through which we come together, allowing our singularity to surface in the exposure to and with the other. Community refers indeed to this sharing of the sensible. This is not to say, however, that by way of our senses we are hedonistically immersed in the image just for the sake of experiencing pleasure. Instead, by entering a relation with the image, we also enter a relation with a possible world that gets disclosed to us through that image. And this evokes Muñoz's idea of queerness as a sense of the incalculable, which was informed by Nancy. Along this trajectory, by postulating the aesthetic as a potentially queer aperture to collectivized forms of solidarity, queerness emerges forcefully as affective relatedness to the world, pointing in the direction of an imaginative collective orientation via the mobilization of our senses. The suggestion that new worldviews might emerge by way of annexing people into a common aesthetic sensorium is metapolitical. By deprivileging an engagement with the indexicality of the image and replacing this with a sensory interaction, I am recasting a queer aesthetics that unearths the not yet real in the fashion image by way of establishing imaginative affective relations among its publics. A A queer community of sense would thus cultivate an ethics of being in common that values the intimacy of shared feelings over sexual, social, or other kinds of distinctions. In this sense, queer aesthetics bring about new possibility for what Jacques Rancière termed the distribution of the sensible, ultimately aiming to a redefinition of a new texture of our life in common. To conclude, by foregrounding the register of sensation, a queer aesthetics would insist upon the possibility of contributing to a sensible reorganization of the world. Within this framework, the fashion image is a possible function of the social order, insofar as it participates in a queer reordering of the sensible. It does so by producing and circulating sensible forms and arrangements that might engender deep resonances between viewers, and that are often at odds with the denotative and statically legible conditions of sensibility as these are posed by the dominant culture. This rupture with the sensory fabric of the dominant order defines aesthetic experience in terms of ambivalence, yielding a new mode of convivial feeling. I'm suggesting that fashion images can outline alternative cartographies of the sensible, mixing materialities and significations, hence troubling the discursive logic of rational interpretation. The aesthetic textures devised through images can unite subjects by way of modes of apperception that defy the presupposition of intelligibility that holds together the tissue of normative aesthetic experience. With its constitutive queerness, the fashion image may thus call into question the dominant order by way of partaking in a sensible repartitioning of the world. The political dimension of the fashion image lies indeed in its aesthetic capacity to present scenes that enact multiple ways of seeing, feeling, and inhabiting the world. Thank you.
Our second speaker today is Dr. Edwin Coomasaru. Eddie is the Sackler Research Forum postdoctoral fellow here at the Courtauld. He completed his PhD in 2018, his research for which examined art produced after the Good Friday Agreement, how cultural representations of the Troubles stage and shatter the historic gender norms which were cultivated to support the conflict. His current research project, Taking Back Control, seeks to examine how a queer, pacifist, or feminist politics might be brought to bear on the political rhetoric and visual culture of Brexit. Edwin's paper today is entitled Hard Brexit Masculinity, Erections, Masturbation, and Taking Back Control. Edwin.
Thank you. It's a real honour to be here. Thank you so much to Andrew and Tilly for organising this. It's a really wonderful event and a joy to be part of. Before I start, I just want to say I've had my ears blocked for 2 weeks until Wednesday, and so now everything is very, very loud. So if I speak very quietly and you can't hear me, please wave, because I'm finding it very difficult to judge the sound of my own voice. But anyway, to a subject that I'm sure is weighing on a lot of our minds at the moment. What does gender or sexuality have to do with Brexit? Has masculinity emerged as a battleground between leavers and remainers in the midst of the EU negotiations? Have anxieties about procreative and effortless erections come to articulate some of the fears and sense of powerlessness both sides of the referendum divide currently feel? While there are ever increasing demands from activists of all persuasions to take back control, perhaps there is also an opportunity here to rethink the idea of heterosexual military masculinity as an organizing principle for society. Now might be a pressing time for the UK to begin to re-evaluate long internalized fantasies about being a rule maker or a major force on the world stage. If the crisis that Brexit represents has been vented through heteronormative and patriarchal concerns about masturbation and erections, maybe we could hold on to precisely what is imagined to be a failure here. It is the very perception of failed masculinity. It is in that very perception of failed masculinity that we might be able to glimpse an image of men, and maybe even of the UK, not defined by dominating others. Masculinity has long been seen as a spectrum. You can have too little, effeminate, or too much, thuggish or brutish, and both are being seen as being out of control. It's only the figure in the middle, military masculinity, that has long been seen as the only subject able to exhibit self-control, self-discipline, and self-sovereignty. In the patriarchal, heteronormative, militaristic imagination, real men must act as a benign custodian for all those who supposedly cannot exert self-mastery. Effeminate men, women, LGBTQ people, those deemed foreign, children and non-humans. So whether or not the 2016 Leave campaign slogan, "To Take Back Control," explicitly mentioned gender, it worked in a conceptual environment where control was closely associated with military masculinity. At the 2018 Conservative Party conference, MP Boris Johnson proclaimed that the Chequers proposal was, quote, "not taking back control, it is forfeiting control." While the next day, outside the venue, Remain protesters held a funeral, exclaiming, "We've now lost control." Like Leavers, since the referendum, Remain activists have repeatedly claimed that their side must take back control. To what extent are such demands made in association with metaphors of masculinity? In June 2017, a photoshopped image of Johnson in a nappy circulated on social media, mocked to make him look like an erotic calling card in a public telephone booth, with the captions, "Posh adult chubby baby, clean up his mess, wankers of the world, putting the N in cuts." Femininity, non-procreative sexuality, and childishness are all being used as an insult here, drawing on a collective imagination where selfishness and narcissism have long been associated with women or LGBTQ people who fail to conform to gender and sexuality norms. Rhetorical strategies deployed to suggest a strong-armed, adult, male, benign custodian must exert order. In June 2018, a member of the public called into BBC radio show Any Answers, complaining, quote, "When we had an empire, we could bully other countries. Now, if we leave the European Union, we will be a small boy." The next day, The Guardian also drew on gendered semantics to describe the prospect of Britain, quote, "in decline into a sullen and impoverished island, like a divorced man drinking alone in a bedsit." What is at stake in these descriptions is the unspoken ideal that lurks in the background, the fantasy of military men as complete masters over themselves and others. Attacks on Johnson certainly focus on his perceived unmanliness. Cartoonist Martin Rowson produced posters of the MP with the word "wank" underneath his portrait. Masturbation has long been seen as a problem for masculinity, rendering men out of control, killing unborn generations, causing ill health and even death, turning firm male flesh soft and flaccid, risking to escalate into same-sex desire. R.J. Brodie's 1845 medical illustration paints a wafer-thin man slumped on a chaise longue, gaunt, feverish, and about to die. If such ideas seem outdated, as recently as 2010, The Guardian ran articles framing pornography as a threat to heterosexual relationships. In 2011, the Daily Mail exclaimed, quote, "Internet pornography destroying men's ability to perform with real women," which detailed how men in the prime of their lives, those of optimum childbearing age, were rendered addicts, subject to, quote, "insomnia, irritability, panic, despair, concentration problems, and even flu-like symptoms." These claims operate in an environment where semantics of contagion and addiction have long been used by homophobia, and they belong to an interconnected web of ideas. Whereas procreative sexuality and military masculinity are associated with metaphors of selfless duty and health, non-procreative sexualities are often claimed to be selfish or a disease that must be contained, queer lives rendered disposable. Militarism is the context here. An imagined binary between procreative military masculinity, who exhibits self-control, and those men who supposedly cannot. For example, in 2015, Johnson insisted that ISIS fighters were, quote, "wankers who watch porn because they can't find girlfriends." A year later, The Guardian reminded readers, quote, "real men don't watch porn, as they, quote, know how to take care of women, i.e. act the role of the custodian." In 2017, The Sun published comments by Johnson that the Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, shot blanks. And this is the image that The Sun used to illustrate the article. Last year, The Guardian warned readers that male masturbators would have difficulties getting an erection. Remainers, of course, are not the only demographic concerned about masculinity and Britain's place on the world stage as Brexit has unfolded. In June 2018, MP Nadine Dorries tweeted her support for the then Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Quote, "David Davis is ex-SAS. He's trained to survive. He's also trained to take people out." A month later, MP Bernard Jenkin exclaimed in The Sun that, quote, "Brexit victory would be like winning the Falklands War, transforming our national confidence and standing in the world." But despite such promises, the Times had begun to panic, repeatedly calling out for a male saviour, imploring in April that, quote, "there's a hole in the centre made for a saviour. By July, our timid leaders can learn from strong men." And in August, quote, "end of days feel in Westminster crying out for strong leadership." Take the last account. The article opens with a description of a Conservative MP sending the journalist a video of two armed men gunning down a passenger in a vehicle to explain his philosophy for a hard Brexit. Johnson himself associates a soft Brexit with effeminacy. In September 2018, he described the negotiations as, quote, "a humiliation. We look like a 7-stone weakling being comically bent out of shape by a 500-pound gorilla." While not explicitly mentioning masculinity, such an image calls to mind Brodie's male masturbator, thin, fragile, and powerless. A month later, the Daily Mail photoshopped Davis's face onto the photo of a Battle of Britain Spitfire pilot, the kind of male saviour so desperately hoped for. The phallus seems to have emerged as a major concern in the UK in the midst of Brexit. The announcement in September 2018 that Viagra was being stockpiled in the case of a no deal led to plenty of innuendos that implied a connection between supporting Brexit and the need for pharmaceutical help getting hard. In December, an MP accused Prime Minister Theresa May of premature parliamentary ejaculation. A member of the public tweeted, quote, "Theresa May still plugging away like a bloke who has lost his erection, insisting he needs a couple more minutes." In January, historian Dan Snow penned an article for The Guardian in which he described how in 1914, and by implication now, Britain's isolation was impotence. In this context, British artist Michael Landy exhibited his artwork Open for Business from June to October at the Riga Biennial in Latvia, a Union Jack-adorned kiosk that sold Leave and Remainer merchandise, including condoms covered in the Union Jack flag with the words "Hard Brexit," while a handwritten sign next to the hatch advised visitors to apply within for the prospect of trade deals. When I spoke to Landy, he explained that the condoms represented a kind of masculinity that was, quote, "very limp and jingoistic, to show its patheticness, to amplify how stilted and flaccid it really is, to show how powerless we really are when it comes down to it." On display in Open for Business, the condoms also seem to be the source of particular amusement for pro-European visitors. Perhaps such reactions imagine contraception, like masturbation, to be a form of failure for a kind of masculinity defined by its procreative potential. So are there any alternative ways of thinking about masculinity in our current political climate? There we go. To mark the centenary of the Battle of Passchendaele, in July 2017, Dutch artist Damien van der Velden exhibited the mud soldier in London's Trafalgar Square. Made out of Flanders mud, the sculpture of a soldier slumped on the ground was encased in a metal frame that sprayed artificial rain. Over the course of the 5 days, his body transformed to mud and mush, excremental flows of sludge and slime. By contrast to the Victorian bronze statues of military men in Trafalgar Square, the mud soldier washed away into a sticky brown swamp. What bearing do such material qualities have on our ideas of masculinity? When Johnson claimed Corbyn would have, quote, "the authority of a wobbly pudding," he was deliberately drawing on soft and semi-liquid metaphors to condemn the Labour leader's effeminate anti-war masculinity. Using similar semantics, in October 2018, Jacob Rees-Mogg registered his dissatisfaction by asking, quote, "why is the government so wet?" While Remain activist Otto English described Davis as a poisonous slug. Do the wet, slimy, semi-liquid material qualities of the mud soldier or the wobbly pudding and poisonous slug share something in common here? Perhaps such references might raise the spectre of humiliation and associations with childish effeminacy. But rather than struggle against such feelings, now may precisely be the time for Britain to face the prospect of coming to terms with them. While various leavers and remainers have both internalised a fantasy of the UK as a major player on the world stage and feel anguish about that idea slipping away from them, maybe we should dwell on that sense of insignificance or loss of mastery, rather than strive to recreate a sense of sovereignty through the frame of military masculinity or the male custodian figure. Shouldn't we come to terms with the fact that the UK is a small nation dependent on its neighbours to survive? When the withdrawal agreement was published, a member of the public on Twitter condemned the government as, quote, a bunch of wet weekends. Nigel Farage is the only one who has the balls. While Remainer MP Heidi Allen, now of the Independent Group, demanded that, quote, MPs must grow a pair. But we can and must abandon military masculinity as an organising principle for society, rather than use effeminacy or non-procreative sexuality as an insult and demand men take back control. Perhaps we can stick with the wet, wobbly, excremental mush of the mud soldier. Instead of seeing these material metaphors as states of shame for the sense of powerlessness they evoke, they might offer an image of masculinity not defined by controlling others. Leave-supporting TV presenter Piers Morgan recently warned feminists not to, quote, turn men into a bunch of neutered, grovelling, blubbering doormats. But it is vital to give image to kinds of masculinity not based on the domination of others. In the case of the mud soldier, there is no macho, muscular, male hero to save the day and restore the UK to an imagined position of ruling the waves. In fact, that very figure has collapsed into excretal mush and been washed away. Could we hold on to this sense of powerlessness? Given that for so long we've understood control through the frame of procreative military masculinity, perhaps we can stay with, rather than rush to dismiss, the profound sense of impotence both leavers and remainers feel. Perhaps it is a kind of impotence that might also challenge deeply ingrained fantasies about Britishness defined by mastery over others. Thanks.